Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Oge Onubogu, the Director of the Africa Program here at the Wilson Center. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you this morning, both those of you here in person and the hundreds of folks that we have online to this conversation today on the experience from Rwanda, memories of genocide and psychosocial effects on young adults and peace building. Our discussion today will outline the impacts that narratives of genocide play in constructing how youth in Rwanda today perceive their relationships with survivors and perpetrators of the 1994 genocide. This conversation today is part of our Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding project, which is a continent-wide network of 22 African policy, research, and academic institutions that work with the Wilson Center Africa program to bring African knowledge and perspectives to U.S., African, and international policy on peacebuilding in Africa. The SVNP was established in 2011. Our key speaker for today is actually an SVNP scholar who has been with us for 3 months now, and this is her final presentation. Ms. Grace Gazingwa is, as I mentioned, an SVNP scholar, and she's also a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Psychology at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Grace's work and experiences center on mental health and psychosocial support in post-conflict societies. Today, we'll be hearing about her experience from Rwanda. Also speaking today and providing comments to her presentation is my dear friend, Dr. Carl Stouffer, who is a senior expert on reconciliation for the U.S. Institute of Peace. Carl has over 30 years of experience and has worked in over 37 countries as a practitioner and also as an academic. We're looking forward to rich conversation today. So Grace, I'm going to hand it over to you. You will present for about 7 minutes, and then we will turn it over to Carl for remarks, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So Grace, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Oge, for a very good introduction. I am presenting on psychosocial effects associated with the 1994 genocide, traumatic memories in Rwanda, and its implications on peace building. I'm talking using the analysis results from the narratives of young people I included in my study, and those young people were aged between 18 and 28 years old. This is the outline. Next to the background, I will talk about the post-genocide peacebuilding initiatives. Among those, there is a bigger one which contributes to the reconciliation, and I will talk about the psychosocial effect and peacebuilding, and then recommendations. In 1994 genocide, more than 1 million people were killed by fellow neighbors, and the genocide left social relations problems. The mistrust became high, and also there were high cases of trauma among people who survived and those who committed the genocide. And now today, there is a high trauma among young people who were born after the genocide, and that is why I'm focusing on this today. Young people in Rwanda is the majority, more than 50%, but more than 10 are suffering from trauma. And fortunately or unfortunately, they are the hope of the country. The country is hoping that this is the generation which will prevent future violence. That is why I am focusing on this. I wondered how can people suffering from trauma contribute to peace building. Many things have been done to address trauma and contribute to reconciliation. Some mechanisms include annual genocide commemoration, national unity and reconciliation, under which Gacaca Court, which was a kind of community justice, was also implemented. And now in Rwanda, this is the promotion of citizenship, just sticking on unified citizenship to prevent a future interethnic conflict. Today, some of those psychosocial, some of those initiatives contribute to this trauma, because during the commemoration, we come back on the trauma of the past. Survivors give testimonies, perpetrators give testimonies about their horrific act, and young people are there. They are helping people to bury in dignity the victims that are still found, but also there are some scars, physical scars and psychological scars, including trauma crisis among parents, which young people are still witnessing. And also there are some family memories which are shared in private spaces, social memories like neighbors, when they're coming back about those memories, how people kill the others, how they looted the things, especially when they're drunk. And sometimes it happens in school. Or young people witness such memories through media or drama or songs that are played most during the morning week in April. So today, young people are suffering from a trauma crisis. Trauma crisis is one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They learn, they hide, they scream as other people as if they have witnessed the traumatic event. They show anxiety, anger, shame, guilty, and some of them are also depressed. I will give one quote about one young person who spoke about his shame due to what his parents did during the genocide. One of them said, though the things he means parental crimes caused me shame and limited me to have an open discussion with others, you know, those are the consequences. Another one said, what I thought for that time when her mother was reading the letter sent by her father from the prison, said, I was afraid that my neighbors will think I am like my father. This troubled me. I thought the community itself will reject me. So apart from that, those trauma psychological effects lead to social effects like stigma, self-stigma, like isolation to escape on that stigma, but also children are suffering from identity problems because of that shame. They think, okay, people are associating me with my parental crimes, or people are seeing me as a child of a genocide survivor. Why should I suffer from this? But the issue is that all of those problems also somehow are contributing to symptoms which can lead to violence in the near future. Like, for instance, some of those who live with fear, they anticipate the danger in the near future. They think, there's people who kill the people may kill me. Then this leads to mistrust. They mistrust families of perpetrators or perpetrators fear families of survivors thinking that they will do revenge. But also there is a kind of feeling of retaliation. Of course, sometimes children think I should revenge against my father because I don't want people to see me, he's a killer. Or I should fight for my family because if I don't kill this person, then next time he will come back to my family and kill us again. So these are the symptoms of trauma, and I try to show how this can, if they continue, if they become chronic, can lead to future violence. How, again, can trauma memories, how are they associated with peacebuilding? Unprocessed traumatic memories are a source of insecurity, as I said. If people live with mistrust, fear of revenge, of being anxious, Obviously, they may develop such kind of symptoms of retaliation, commit some violent actions. Psychosocial effect on traumatic memories are sustaining social fragmentation. You know, relationships are limited within families, within communities, but also intergenerational trauma memory risk reproduction of violent retaliation, as I said before. Here are key policy recommendations. I got this recommendation from different people, including people interviewed around the DC. And I think for the government of Rwanda, they should consider the risk of psychosocial effect associated with genocide memory, especially this commemoration event, which bring back the narrative of the past and which cause most cases of trauma crisis. They should define a strategy to respond to intergenerational trauma among post-genocide generation in the future and revise the mental health and reconciliation policies and programs. For civil societies, we have many civil societies intervening in Rwanda, but they should prioritize intergenerational trauma healing and ethnic group dialogues, which promote remorse and forgiveness among survivors and perpetrators, to facilitate social cohesion and reconciliation, but also to facilitate breaking the cycle of trauma among the first generation, which can help also to transmit resilience across generations. For international funding organization, I think this is time to come back to the post-genocide societies. Most of the time, international organizations provide humanitarian and they focus on a crisis. But when the societies looks a little bit stable, they go away. They don't continue to provide assistance. So I think it's a time to also think about the post-genocide societies, post-conflict societies, and also consider intergenerational trauma as main driver to future violence. They should enhance collaboration. Different organizations have programs for reconciliation, for trauma healing. They have mental health policies, but there are no programs that coordinate mental health and psychosocial program for peace building. They should enhance collaborate to have well-defined strategies for peace building, and also establish MHPSS programs for peace building and its coordination, and design a global policy program to respond to this kind of issues, because young people are people who have energy. They are easily influenced by adult people, especially when they are traumatized. And for your information, trauma most of the time will take place during the 25 first years and until 24 years. When people are less than 24 years old, it's easy to influence them because they're not strong enough to make their own decisions. So this is an important thing to consider while envisioning to prevent future violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. Thank you. A lot to unpack there, and already a lot of questions in my head here, but I'm going to turn it over to Carl now to make a few remarks as well.
Thank you, Oge, and it's really wonderful to be with you today. And thank you, Grace. Congratulations on this important work. You have chosen a topic that is critical in proportions, but is still not theorized and researched enough to be prioritized in the peace-building field. And so therefore, your attempts to link the generational transmission of trauma and sustainable peace-building is noteworthy. And you're building into a long-term project that has consequential implications for conflict prevention in your country and for generations to come. In many ways, as opening remarks, I want to say one of our biggest challenges in this whole discussion is what to do with memory. What to do with memory. We will remember. It's in our DNA. It's in our physiological makeup. So we will remember. So how will we remember? Miroslav Volf once put it this way: how do we remember rightly in a violent world? And so this becomes our challenge. Many times our memory exercises performances and rituals do not allow us to move from the past to the present to the future, and we become stuck in the past. And this is the biggest challenge, I think, that Rwanda and other groups coming out of severe violence, other nations and countries and peoples are trying to deal with. Part of the obstacles in memory is that, and I believe strongly, that we should commemorate the past, but it must always be paired with the hope for a future, a shared future of some kind. And often that second part, that hope for a shared future, is not realized or intentionally pursued. And so, for instance, in Vietnam, we're working in Vietnam, and that's a 50-year conflict between the US and Vietnam, and it's at a very, very high level of comprehensive agreement right now. The War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City tells the story of the war and has done that for decades. They have finally now invited USIP to come alongside them and open a permanent exhibit that will look at the reconciliation efforts, including citizen diplomacy, et cetera, that we have been engaged in since that war. And that's a good indication of moving in the direction of reconciliation and healing. I can talk more about the memory, but we can take that up on the discussion. A few other things I just might mention that stand in the way in this memory is patriotic history, when history is rewritten according to patriotic or ideological strongholds. There is what we call genocidal history, which is actually theoretical research coming out of the Central Africa region, Burundi, Rwanda, and Eastern Congo. And this is the idea that history begins to be formed and retold and written and configured around genocide. And this then limits history and its ability to actually transform our current existence. And lastly, I'll mention historians talk about silences and mentions. And most of our history books are full of silences and mentions according to the authors who decide what they want to put in and what they want to leave out. And so part of our job in this work of reconciliation and transitional justice is finding ways to bring the silences back to the fore and incorporate them back into our histories. Memory can be a shield or it can be a sword. This is the challenge, and this is the irony. It can be a shield for identity, healing, acknowledgement, solidarity, protection. But at the same time, just across from that, it can be a sword that's used for dehumanization, for wounding or vengeance, for denial or deception, division or insecurity. I want to just say there's a few global challenges before I respond to a few specific recommendations that you've made, Grace. I think there's at least 3, if not many more global challenges. Let me see if I can put those forward. I think, first of all, one of our major challenges is, as I mentioned earlier in the introductory remarks, this thing of generational transmission of trauma needs to be centered as a critical component of war to peace transitions. It needs to be embedded in our transitional justice architecture. Like human rights or humanitarian aid are now institutionalized as responses in post-war situations. I would imagine the day when trauma recovery and resilience becomes institutionalized as a response after conflict. Secondly, it needs to be decoupled from the dominant Western cultural approach to mental health and psychosocial support. As important as that is, and mostly I subscribe to hybridized models that usually take the best practices of Western therapeutic models and many, many powerful and appropriate healing processes that are the assets of communities most affected by the war. And bringing those together can be a very powerful mix for healing in post-war conflicts. I would note Famble Talk, the indigenous process that was resurrected in Sierra Leone in West Africa to try to deal with that brutal civil war. And we see tremendous results from that. It's now impacting the national agenda for local development, the model that they developed. Thirdly, it needs to be rolled out, this thing of trauma recovery and resilience and transmission. It needs to be rolled out in collectivized, culturally relevant programs at all levels of society. I think the key barriers there, of course, are the obvious: political will, scaling this up, and resources. There needs to be a tremendous amount of resources dedicated to this. Let me just comment on a few of the specific recommendations from the three sectors that Grace put forward. Government, I think when we think about government, we really do desperately need a whole of society framework for governments to work with. When I say whole of society, just a few characteristics. Material and social support need to be integrated. We need the tangible and the intangible, the symbolic and the material, to be brought together in an integrated fashion in our programmatic work. Second of all, we need relevant activities that meet the human needs, as I mentioned before, of the present and the future, so that we do not remain stuck in the past. And lastly, there's some growing research showing that we need to think about violence, and I think war and genocide and other forms of violence can fall into these places as a public health crisis, a public health issue, and how it is transmitted is actually closer to how something is transmitted, a pandemic disease, something is transmitted through a society, as opposed to strictly looking at its social or psychological aspects of it. Civil society, I think there's a critical role for the civil society to play what John Paul Lederer calls the middle out approach, so that they have most of a civil society that is not co-opted has connections to the top and to the bottom, the vertical and the horizontal work, and that's important so that they can roll out community-based, culturally sensitive programs at a local level, and also advocate for trauma-informed education and resilience at a government level, vertical. The role of parents, which Grace mentions, is very important. I think complementing any trauma work, there needs to be some dialogue work for educational purposes. And in this situation, an intergenerational dialogue, where we're bringing the multiple generations together to think about how to not only talk about the past and the loss and the truth-telling part, as I've mentioned before, but also to dialogue about positive transmission of stories, of history, and of vision for a shared future. Lastly, the international funding organizations Grace mentions also and gives recommendations around, I think, two things that are obvious. Obviously, the funding field will need to move away from 1 to 3 year project cycle funding and think about long-term funding, because transmission of trauma is generational. We have to begin to think decadal if we're going to, if this is going to survive. Long-term reflexive programming. And finally, Grace also has spoken about a global policy. While this is important for standardized applications, it is deeply challenging, as we would all know, to find the right balance between the universal and the particular, that need for adaptability and flexibility at a local level. I don't know if my time is up, but I think it probably is.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much, Carl. So we're going to open this up for questions now. Questions, comments, or discussion. So let's look around the room if anyone has a question. Sir, go ahead.
It's very interesting on this topic. I was just talking.
I'm sorry, sir, if I could ask you to introduce yourself as you ask your question.
Ray Michael Bridgewater, President and CEO, Chief Strategist of the Assembly of Petworth. Organization concentrates around health and technology. I was just having a discussion about a situation here in Washington, D.C., where we're dealing with violence and the issue of trauma. So I once told somebody, I don't know how many people are Star Trek film watchers, but I wish I could put my hand on a person's hand and make them forget the past and make them forget the pain. but that's not reality. And what we're dealing with here is the reality of a lot of pain. My question is, the good doctor brought up the aspect of public health. We're looking at, my organization in collaboration with other people are looking at a health initiative in Rwanda, utilizing telemedicine medical mobile units to reach out and connect the population. What are you seeing other health issues? We know mental health is a big issue. What are some of the other health issues that are happening in Rwanda with the youth as well as with the elders?
Thank you very much. We can take another question. So we have 2 questions for them to respond to. If there isn't another question, I'll have you all, Grace, you can start responding to that while folks are still thinking of another question. Or you want to go? Okay, hold on.
Thank you so much for these really interesting remarks. I'm Amanda Katzberl. I work for USAID, but I'm a governance specialist, and I work particularly on constitutional change after conflict. I'm just wondering, in Rwanda's case, it strikes me that the reforms to the Constitution that were made after the genocide actually kind of froze in place a certain amount of tension between groups and a certain narrative around perpetrators and victims that has, I think, not proven to be a very good foundation for democracy and governance and a culture of human rights. So I'm just wondering if you can reflect a little bit on how trauma also then kind of plays out in political processes, and when it does, how that can hurt a country's ability to transition towards stability. Thank you.
Okay, so Grace and Carl, you can chime in here too as well. So 2 questions. The first question on health, other health issues in Rwanda, and the second question on trauma and how that plays out in political processes in the country.
Thank you for your good questions. About the first question, which is asking other health issues in Rwanda, we normally have other problems you may know that are happening in other countries, like African countries, like malaria, there is HIV, and the other problems, but I will not speak much about that because I'm in the field of mental health and the peace building. But yeah, malaria, HIV, but HIV is not so high as the trauma now because HIV is about 3%, and a lot of effort has been made to eradicate it. And I know that USAID is also involved into supporting public health to eradicate that HIV. But unless HIV, malaria, I think those are the main problems now, health issues now. This intergenerational trauma is just coming up now. Yeah, and the problem is that it's not easily observed. You may see people looking healthy, looking mentally healthy, with people smiling, but deep down they are suffering. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry for the second question. I'm only focusing, I only interviewed the young people. I did not include the political or the politicians in my study, so I will not be able to say anything about this. I'm sorry.
Put this on. Carl, I don't know if you'd be able to chime in here just more broadly on how trauma impacts the transition process in countries like Rwanda or others.
Sure. I mean, I think the level of political interference in the transition process is absolutely critical. And there's always a temptation to be politically engaged and intervene in particular because the transition is such a sensitive time. And one of the key areas that we need to track carefully is the formation of the social narrative or the social political narrative, which can often be guarded and steered in a very particular direction, which sometimes can be negative in the actual broad-based healing that needs to happen in a country. And so I think part of the challenge in Rwanda and many other places has been, a particular language or vocabulary being or ideological sort of connection to that vocabulary being propagated as the best, the social narrative, the social political narrative. And the point of transition is this challenge to find a future where there's a shared future, where all conflicting parties can imagine themselves there. As long as there's no place in that future, the narrative of the future for a particular party that has been marginalized or dominated in the past, it'll become very difficult to find that transition which will allow everyone to move together. And so I think constitution making, as well as the way we set up any legal parameters around transitional justice processes, as well as the type of media and what is propagated from public sources of information, all play critical roles in the outcome. And that's a very important challenge. As I said earlier this morning, the silences and the mentions, the sort of patriotic history, and if that is watch guarded too closely, it can be hoisted upon a whole country and allow the country not to develop to the place that it wants to in its future view.
Thank you very much, Carl. And I also want to remind our online audience that they can send questions as well online. And we do have a question online, and it's from John Pierce. And his question is, are there still perpetrators of the genocide in prison? How does that impact the reconciliation efforts of those who were born of the perpetrators, those who might still be in prison? Grace, you want to go ahead and take that while others are still thinking about questions?
Yeah, yes, we still have many perpetrators in the prison, but also most of them are completing their sentences, except those who have life sentences in prison. And you can imagine growing up without having two parents. You can imagine how growing up taking food to the person who is not providing for the family sound. You can imagine how one can deal with the image of having a father or a mother who killed people, including children, including mothers, including friends or family members. It's a very complicated, and it hinders reconciliation, because that experience of having a parent in prison traumatizes these children, and sometimes they feel they are willing to be reconciled with others, but sometimes their parents are still denying their crimes. They say they are innocent. They still silence about all of their crimes. And also the parent at home also does not want to provide the true version of the story. And then, even if those children want to contribute to reconciliation, even if they want to have that full story, to be able to repent on the behalf of their parents, but still they don't know which story to tell. They don't know how to say that because they don't have a complete story to say. So that is the challenge, because it's very difficult to go forward, to reconcile while you still have your identity problems, you still have challenges that you are facing in the community, you still have no complete history or no complete narrative to take on when you go to seek for forgiveness. Yeah, it's very challenging. It's very challenging, and that is why descendants of perpetrators sometimes choose to isolate themselves, to withdraw from social from social life, to just be alone, because they don't know how to accommodate their trauma, but also how to live with others, with the victims of their parents' crimes. Yeah.
So maybe as a follow-on to that, do you see in your experience and with a lot of the young people that you've interviewed, do you see a large number of young people who are children of perpetrators usually isolating themselves? And are there any specific efforts targeted towards this subgroup of young people?
Yeah, I met many young people. The example of how they isolate, for instance, themselves is that sometimes they choose to drop out of school because they are not able to stay. Some of them said, whenever I enter the classroom, I can't focus on my studies. I lose my concentration because I keep thinking on how my mother is struggling to work hard for our survival and how hard she's working also to sustain the life of our father in prison. Then I lose concentration. I can't succeed in school. Then I have chosen to drop out of school. But also, there are others who say at school, people refuse to share meals with me during lunch time because, in Rwanda, children are fed at school at noon. They refuse to share meals with me because my father is in prison because he killed the people. You can imagine. Then they isolate themselves. I met many young people, but unfortunately, there is no specific intervention for those kids, for those children.
Thank you very much, Grace. I see a question in the back, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Nader. I'm a senior fellow here at the Wilson Center. Both the question of the funding, prioritizing the trauma healing processes, especially in situations where you have a post-conflict and you immediately enter to a situation where the needs are so enormous and the current health issues are so enormous. And I, from experience of Afghanistan, where there was an enormous level of generosity of donor funding, but taking the destruction and the need of the entire health sector and other needs, it has become so difficult to prioritize dealing with trauma and healing as a key issue as part of the conflict prevention for the future. How that worked out both in Sierra Leone and in Rwanda and other places to bring about an element of dealing with trauma as a healing process and future conflict prevention, because it is not to stack, as you said, in the past, but to think of today and future generation. So that's a major challenge both for the donors, but also for the civil society and the government organizations to deal with it. A second issue, in our experience, I led an investigation of the 3 decades of the war. So it was part of the healing process and reconciliation in Afghanistan. And this major documentation was partially giving a picture to look at the new foundation of the political setup and creating more traumas when people were looking that some of the perpetrators were sitting in front row in the government. But then the question was, shall we release this report of 1,000 pages with this enormous amount of information out there? Would it add to traumatization of society, or it will help healing? The decision at that time we made was to, unless it's a whole of government approach, we wouldn't put this out there. How this dichotomy between, for purpose of healing, you bring about the facts and truths out there about what has happened, but also to manage further escalation of trauma and violence in society. What was the way and methods in Rwanda and other cases? I would be interested also to hear from Carl on that. Thank you.
Thank you. You want to go ahead, Carl?
I'll start with a few comments, maybe more general, and then you can speak specifically to Rwanda. Thank you. Yeah, I think you've said a number of really important things, comments, and let me just tack on a few things. The long-term lens is absolutely critical, and I know we hear that everywhere, and many of us who are working with funders may not feel like that's changing, though I think it is. I personally have already seen it in action in Sierra Leone, for instance. Now, it was private funding, but there was actually a private funder foundation, a family foundation, that gave the initial seed money for Famble Talk a 15-year commitment. Now, this wasn't their only source of funding. They got other funding. But that was the type of commitment that this foundation said we're going to make, because we know that if the war lasted for at least 12 years, probably the healing's going to last for at least that long, if not longer. And but I think that still has to creep into our larger institutions for sure, so that we can understand the investment there. And I think you hit it well on the prevention investment. This is our biggest challenge, is to get that argument out there, because I think what we understand is with this kind of work on the ground, I think the work of Famble Talk, which reached thousands, tens of thousands of people, is one of the best hopes for Sierra Leone not to revert back into the violence of the past. Even though Famble Talk didn't use any of the language of the transitional justice field per se, and it was written off as a sort of an anthropological reconciliation ritual, I argue that it actually filled the goals of transitional justice for the Sierra Leonean people in a way that the special court that was set up in Sierra Leone, as well as the Truth Commission, were not able to touch. And they were much more expensive mechanisms. I'll just say a little on the truth-telling. Yes, I think you put a very good challenge forward on will we re-traumatize with the truth, and how do we release the information? Where do we place it? What do we do with it to make it whole? And I think our challenge, truth-telling is a deep challenge. We hear so much now about truth-telling as a right and truth-telling as a core pillar, of course, in the UN, transitional justice, et cetera. And I believe that. What I'm a little concerned about in certain circles which I run is where truth-telling seems to be equated with healing. And it's not. It's what we do with the truth. The truth itself can be quite hard. It's not a healing mechanism in its own right. It may help to shed light onto something that helped people to feel like they can breathe again and they understand something that was, that they were completely unaware of. But it doesn't lead to healing unless we handle the truth in the right way. And so I think South African Truth Commission in their preamble had a very interesting set of categories of truth. They talked about forensic truth, which is the truth that our trials and our courtrooms, seek after. But then they said there's a second truth, and that is our personal truth. Each of us have our own story. We have our own narrative. We have our own experience. Every genocide survivor has their own story. It's not a universal story, and that's their specific truth, and that needs to be heard. And then there's this tricky thing, which is where the politics and the power dynamics come in, and which makes it so difficult, and that is the social-political truth, the social-political narrative, and how that will be formed, and how we put that together. And then they mentioned a fourth truth, and this is the one that's most striking to me, and that is they said there is a healing truth. Now, I'd like to see a PhD or something on a healing truth. I don't know what that looks like yet, but from my experience, I think it has something to do with actually bringing the forensic, the personal, and the political into some kind of Venn diagram or something to that effect that would allow us to use bits and pieces of that, and to accept all of those will mean some compromise, will mean some give and take in society. But that's important for coming to a healing truth.
Well, thank you very much, Carl. I think your last response there, the last piece of your response there, Carl, actually responded to the question. But Grace, if you want to speak if you want to add anything on there and speak specifically to the case in Rwanda on how managing this truth-telling process has helped with and I guess not to equate truth-telling and healing, but how managing this process has helped to avoid re-traumatization in society. If you want to speak specifically to Rwanda.
Yeah, thank you. It's very difficult to say that truth-telling prevented re-traumatization. It's very difficult to say because the truth of the genocide acts, the truth of the genocide crimes, for instance, during Gacaca courts, victims were here, perpetrators were here, and all of them had to talk about the experiences, genocide experiences. You can imagine how it's traumatizing to listen on how people kill the other people, how people spend days in the marshlands hiding without having food. It was a good truth to hear, but it was also it had a traumatizing side because it was about a horrific events. It's not easy to say that it did not traumatize the people, but I come back and add on what Carl said. The truth-telling during transition justice, including even the narratives that we witnessed during the genocide commemoration. In Rwanda, that truth helped us to at least learn the truth about what happened in the past. At least young people are learning about the genocide history. They have knowledge of what happened in the past. At least survivors are able to find dead bodies of their family members and bury them in dignity. And in my previous research, survivors say that reburying own family member in dignity is taking the grave from the heart to let the dead rest. And as the dead rest, the victim also rests. That is from their narratives. So even if it is traumatizing, but sometimes it has that side of hearing where people at least get rid from their grief, say, I know this person has been killed in this way, he was thrown here, and now I have his body, and now I bury him, so he's dead. Because there are some people who are still in confusion, who do not know where their family members were thrown during the genocide. You can imagine living, waiting for someone, don't know where he is and when he will come back. But when they have truth, that is when they start to heal, and that is where the strength to forgive starts from. So even if the truth can traumatize people, but it has that side for positive results. And coming back to what Carl said, the truth helps people to make meaning of the past. As we reconstruct meaning, then we can learn on how to live with that past without the past taking us, but we learn to integrate that past, go with it without being taken by it. That is the powerful side of the truth-telling. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Grace. We have a couple of questions online, but also want to remind folks in the room too as well, still time for questions, and folks online as well, you can send your questions in. So 2 questions here. One from a colleague at the State Department Program for Population Refugee Migration focused on Africa. And this question is for you, specifically, Grace. How does mental health reconciliation efforts affect migration away from Rwanda or the return of young people to Rwanda after they've migrated away? So what are the impacts of how does mental health reconciliation efforts affect migration away from Rwanda or return back to Rwanda? And then I have a second question here from a senior fellow in our history program, and this is specifically for you, Carl. Carl, you mentioned the War Museum in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And are Vietnamese suffering from war crimes on a scale that Americans should study as genocide on a scale similar to what we study in Rwanda? So 2 questions. Grace, if you want to go ahead and start first with the first, and then Carl will take the second.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering how I will do my presentation today. I wanted to just show the images of the traumatic memories that we are dealing in Rwanda, but they are also traumatizing. And now I will try to just respond to this question by saying that even if the past is the past, but we have some memory representations that we can witness. But most of those representations are in our mind. We can't go far away from those representations. They are sticking somewhere in our mind. And I think that is why people who are still affected by those memories, like they may also still having fear of living in the society. And in Rwanda, it's very critical because perpetrators and survivors are living in the same community side by side. We have many graves around the community. Each corner of the community has mass graves where people were buried. We have memorial sites where you can witness human remains of dead bodies, where you can witness identities, their clothes, their names, their pictures, you know. Imagine those people who have those memories in their minds. They may be suffering from fear, from trauma of staying in the same community, and then they choose to go to exile just to see whether they can have safety, thinking that they can just relax a bit, to go far away from those memories, thinking that they can be able to relax a bit. And I think that is how trauma affects refugee away from Rwanda. Even if they move, they may go away thinking they are away of memories, but they still live with those memories with them. And then sometimes they wish to come back to see whether their own people are still alive in Rwanda. You know, that is how trauma works. Yeah, you think you leave it behind, but you go with it, and that is the way I think it affects refugee away from Rwanda. They still have those memories, but also they are still attached to their family members in the community. And for sure, I think I've been here for 3 months, almost 3 months, and it's very difficult to get detached from your motherland, you know. Here also, there is a trauma. Even if you say now it's almost 600 years away from colonialism, but we see signs of violence, which can be maybe a sign of that the trauma of colonialism is still traveling across the generations. We hear gunshots during the night, and I was asking my neighbor, why are people shooting during the night? In Rwanda, it's not common. It may happen, it's not common. Then I was afraid, I was saying, what is happening here? What is happening in this community? And one of my housemates, who is a white lady working at George Washington University, here there are problems, there are problems. She said, when I go to my work every morning, I drive as a crazy woman because I don't know what may happen to me. Trauma stays for long years, and people can keep it and share it for generations and generations, and that is where it's difficult.
Thank you very much, Grace. Carl, you have a question?
Sure, thank you for the question. I'll come at the question with a number of different responses. I think we first of all have to be clear on a baseline that trauma is felt universally no matter how many or how few people have been killed or how they've been killed. Violence is traumatizing. It doesn't matter if you're fighting the just cause or not the just cause. Violence is traumatizing. Let's name that as a baseline. So, for instance, numbers make a difference, but they don't necessarily change that. Second of all, I think the Vietnam case is very complex. It's been through a tremendous amount of ups and downs, the first 20 years of no bilateral relations between the two countries. What was significant over that time is the citizen diplomacy that went forward from both sides, Vietnam and the U.S., mostly pressed by veterans and survivors of Agent Orange, of unexploded ordinances, and those trying to together search for the remains of disappeared. And so I think there's been a tremendous amount of goodwill from both political sides, building on that citizen diplomacy that has allowed us to move to the place where we are, where Biden just signed the comprehensive agreement, which is the highest agreement sort of in trade and investment between two countries recently with Vietnam. Now, how Vietnam should be studied in the United States, there's a lot of work to talk about how it is represented in many parts of our U.S. history, how they are represented in our textbooks, and how they are represented in an even-handed way. And so, I mean, it's obvious. The Vietnamese call this the American War, the U.S. war, and we call it the Vietnam War. That's part of the problem with the violence, And I think the memorialization that Vietnam has done has not hidden the tremendous toll and the pain of that. I think the U.S. has shown through its actions that it wants to build another type of relationship. I think the U.S. has always been challenged to know how to make public apology a real effort in their transitional processes. And so therefore, I think we're continually struggling with history and how to understand history and how to act on that history. I would say this, there is a tremendous amount of cooperation going on between the two countries, and there is also very different worldviews on what repentance, forgiveness, remorse looks like, and what reparations looks like. And I want to just assure whoever asked the question, there is a lot of dialogue going on, not just between political, around economy and investments and so on, but between citizens on both sides, and between the youth, the next generation, the ones who are born after the violence, the ones, and then dialogues between our Asian American, Vietnamese American youth and youth back in Vietnam, and those are important aspects of the healing work that still needs to be done, even 50 years later, in U.S.-Vietnam relations.
Thank you very much, Carl. Thank you, Grace. Let me come to the room now and see if we have questions. Ender?
Hey, good afternoon. Mike Flaherty. I'm a public policy fellow here at Wilson Center. Carl, you mentioned Fumble Talk as an exemplar of blending the traditional justice with the Western transitional justice model. One of the theories behind doing that was to get at this intergenerational transmission of trauma and healing. I don't know how successful it has been long-term in Sierra Leone, but I wanted to get your opinion, Grace, and given the topic of your research, I may know a little bit of it, but how successful have the Gacaca courts been in mitigating some of this generational trauma? Because in Sierra Leone, the idea was, get to the family-to-family healing, within village healing with the Fumble Talk. Has that had any positive effect on this? Because I would imagine Fumble Talk's probably going to be used as a model for other cases in the future. Has the Gacaca courts had any positive effect on this mental health and intergenerational issue that you're talking about? Thanks.
Do we have another question in the room? If not, let's take that question, Grace.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that as trauma can be transmitted, healing can be transmitted, resilience can be transmitted from parents to children, from community members to community members. It can be horizontal or vertical transmission. I mean, from parents to children or from peers to peers. So coming back to your question, I think for those who have been helped by Gacaca to find the truth, to heal from Gacaca, also they help their children to also move on. But the issue is that Gacaca was closed in 2012, and the young generation I am researching on, most of them were small, and children were not allowed to attend the Gacaca. So what I think is that there has been probably that intergenerational positive effects from parents to children. For those parents who were able to hear from Gacaca have transmitted also hearing to their children, even if they were still small. I'm talking of this because some community-based approaches that are working in Rwanda have proven that there is that hearing aspect in families due to parents taking place in peace-building interventions, and also this hearing interventions, and I think Gacaca also has contributed to that in that way. But unfortunately, these children did not attend, and most of them grew up when Gacaca was over, and those who attended it accidentally when they just went to attend as kids when they were coming, for instance, from school, or when they were there and the Gacaca were happening around their houses. But yeah, I think in that way Gacaca maybe played the role through an intergenerational transmission of hearing from the truth talks in Gacaca courts. Yeah. That's what I can say. Yeah. Yeah, but there is no study. So far there is no study that has been conducted to measure the hearing, how many people have been heard. I mean, young people heard through these processes. There is no study conducted yet, but there have been studies on Gacaca courts, on truth-telling and hearing on Gacaca courts. And also there are mental health services. Unfortunately, people do not use them because mental health disorders are associated with the stigma. And yeah, they avoid using them, or they are not aware of those services. And some of those services are providing medication. And people think if you take medication, you are mad, you have a psychosis. That is the challenge. But I think an intergenerational hearing took place somehow. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we have one question online. It's just coming online, and this is from Charles Quaylam, who is a senior peace education and advocacy associate. And so this question is for both Grace and Carl. He says, how will the both of you envision a reimagination of peace building and peacemaking in the context of managing the effects of trauma by the Rwandan youth? What practical approaches could lead to deep transformation of intergenerational relationships amidst political dynamics? So I guess that's the second part of the question. What practical approaches could lead to deep transformation of intergenerational relationships amidst the political dynamics that we see in Rwanda? So who would like to go first? Grace?
Yeah. Thank you. As I said in my recommendations, we need intergenerational dialogue, and also Carol mentioned that intergenerational hearing dialogues, which are trauma-informed, by trauma-informed for peace building. We do not only need to focus on talking on trauma, but we also need to discuss together on how we can envision a peaceful future. So I think intergenerational hearing spaces are needed, and those intergenerational healing spaces should encourage remorse and remorse from perpetrators and forgiveness from survivors, to be able to reconcile, and as the people meet and discuss about their past and discuss how they can go together toward the future, they can get socially cohesive, and they can envision together, to work together through economic development activities, and from there they can live peacefully. And also I suggested intergroup dialogues, and those intergroup dialogues will not only focus on their trauma, but also to discuss about the consequences of the genocide, and also to raise awareness about the problems that are found in the community, and how to also help younger generations to also contribute, because these intergenerational dialogues and inter-ethnic dialogues should include the youth, because the youth can contribute. They need to be involved. They need to learn from adults. They need to learn from the past to be able to also plan for their future and the future of their societies. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that question, Charles, my friend. I would say a few things here without necessarily knowing well the Rwandan context, so these will be more general. But I think some work in Burundi, I would inform this, that where I was involved in the central province of Gitega, where we found inter-ethnic efforts at multiple levels. They built a mobile medical clinic hired from both ethnic groups. They had a restaurant called Amahoro, which in Kurundi means peace. And it was a restaurant not only for serving food, but also a dialogue space. They used it for dialogue and food, which was very emblematic of reconciliation, of course, in the culture. They also helped to rewrite curriculum for one of the primary schools, and convinced the government to have the government curriculum in the morning and a peace-building curriculum in the afternoon. And that was a very active curriculum. It was not only inside the school, but they took Hutu and Tutsi children together to visit, for instance, orphanages, and to be involved in food distribution and clothing distribution and connections. This was much closer to the time of the violence, 1999. They also went ahead and built a peace-building curriculum that they started to train in the communities surrounding and setting up mediation committees. They went further and also put together inter-ethnic reconstruction teams who went to each other's villages and communities and rebuilt the damage from the war. And by that was like integration of both reconstruction and reconciliation, because it allowed for both of those activities to be visible. And finally, or finally, I guess it was the infrastructure that they began to build around the mediation in these communities. The youth need to be involved in all of this, and they can be involved in it, especially as I remember reading the policy brief from Grace. There was this discussion of how the government has focused on, to a certain age, I think 14, as youth, and yet we have this 14 to 30 gap, and we really must begin to engage. Back to my thing of remembering. Yes, we remember to grieve the past, the lost, to rebuild relationships, but we also remember in order to problem solve. We can't problem solve unless we remember what we need to problem solve about. We also need to remember to shift narratives, because we hold current narratives accountable to those who know what happened and who experienced it, and we remember to educate and to re-educate. And so those are other kinds of very concrete practices, problem solving, shifting narratives, and education that we need to think about configuring our sustained peace-building effort around, as opposed to configuring it around the past. As I've mentioned before, I'm not neglecting the past, but that has a space. But the past must build us towards. I'm thinking of even in our memorialization processes, can we turn those memorializations also into commemorations of what has happened and where we are going for the future, as opposed to only looking backwards. As John Paul Lederach says, peacebuilding is going backwards and forwards at the same time, and it's a very stretching sort of exercise, but it's absolutely critical, because otherwise, as I mentioned before, we get stuck. Arts-based projects, I think, are critical. We used video dialogue in the South African context to help communities deal with their intra-violence that happened, but also the inter-group violence that happened. And we found out that the video became a better mediator than any of us in the civil society who were mistrusted or seen to have been, on one side or the other. And so these are important aspects of what we do. Sierra Leone has a tremendous follow-up in their Fambo Talk process, where they set up football tournaments, they set up talking on the radio and speaking in schools. They work on cooperative farms together, victims and offenders. They have made each village set up a negotiation space where conflicts can be taken before they turn violent, and elders come and work with them on that. They've done a lot of economic development through small income generating projects and loan and lending and loan associations. And so that's just to name a few of the really critical ways in which in our follow-up we can bring these processes together, and I think youth can drive those in especially important ways.
Thank you so much, Carl. No more questions online. Do we have any other questions in the room? Okay, go ahead.
Not so much of a question, but an agreement with what you're saying, because we're using very similar things here in Washington, D.C. We developed a therapeutic drama program to utilize decision-making and coping skills, and using it from the aspect of teaching youth how to solve their problems and make good decisions, instead of looking at it from the aspect of being disrespected and going home and getting a gun and coming back out firing. So we are using medical mobile units. We turn those mobile units into health fairs. We turn those health fairs where we bring in social workers to work with not only the youth, but with the entire family. Because we see if you don't work with the entire family, you're not going to solve too much of anything. Food distribution, job training, some of the other things that we utilize. Excuse me. The development of programs, entrepreneurship, and so forth. So I'm in total agreement. Not knowing, really what the situation there, we find that is working here in the D.C. with the youth, fatherhood initiatives, women initiatives to work with the women and with the young boys in their decision making and how they make decisions. I think that is a big piece. That therapeutic drama piece is huge with the youth as they're dealing not only with violence but dealing with their sexuality. So we're able to deal with several issues all at the same time. So that may be something that may be useful in Rwanda without being there on the ground and seeing what happened. That would be something that I think would be helpful to the youth as well as being a intergenerational, because it's going to take a intergenerational aspect. When we're dealing with fatherhood issues, we're dealing with a generation of issues that affect men. And it's not only psychological, but it's also a social, sexual aspect of how they deal with their children.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those experiences with us. And before we close, Grace, would you like to share any final thoughts with us before we go ahead and close? Anything you'd like to share?
Yeah. Thank you all for attending the presentation, and thank you for the questions and the comments. I really feel privileged to be here today, and I really like that now people start to understand this issue of intergenerational trauma. Even if I had not much time to talk about that, but it has long-term consequences which may hinder the healthy vision, healthy minds, like drug abuse. They are likely to go for drug abuse and developing antisocial behaviors like unwanted pregnancies among young Rwandans is also increasing. And, a lot of things may be associated with that, but also there might be other factors. I wanted just to highlight that all of the problems that youth are facing are not only resulting from intergenerational trauma. There might be other factors in the communities, in the families, which make them to be more vulnerable to trauma, or which can facilitate the healing or hinder the healing. But what is most needed is that we can work collaboratively to help young people to be resilient so that we can ensure we are breaking this cycle of trauma, thus ensuring peace in the future. Thank you all for being with me and with the whole program today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you, Carl, for your comments and adding to the conversation. Obviously, Grace, from the number of questions and engagements that we got from the room and online, it is obvious that this topic on intergenerational trauma is one that folks are really interested in. So we thank you for spending this 3 months with us here to study this work. We know it was hard for you to be away from Rwanda, but we hope that as you have, we've had this conversation, that the thoughts and the ideas that folks have shared with you today will help to continue to strengthen your work and research. And we can't wait to see all the amazing things that you will do accomplish through this work. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Grace. Thank you so much, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your day.